If you follow what's going on around the world today, and particularly in the United States of America, you might be tired of this whole political exchange between the California governor, Gavin Newsom, and the sitting US President Donald Trump. Or you might be offended by the President Trump's address at the UN Assembly. Now, keep in mind, those are just the political rhetorics. And of course, that today, when we pay closer attention to the political rhetoric, not only those words create huge impact among the voters domestically and internationally, but it's another critical aspect is the economic agenda. How do we understand at this moment? Now, recently, so many international diplomats have paid closer attention or a visit to the United Nations, not only to address the international issues, but also to smooth out what's not been right around the world. And some experts strongly believe that it's time for UN to find a new location. And how about one of the major cities, China, which is Shanghai? How do we understand that? Is that a bold belief? Or we can actually see that coming in the near future. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who's the Dr. Vinicius De Freitas. Dr. Vinicius is a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, focusing on international law, international relations, and Brazil, and he's currently a visiting professor of international law and international relations at China Foreign Affairs University in Beijing, China. Well, Dr. Vinicius, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Always good to talk to you, Will.
Well, Dr. Vinicius, again, as we mentioned before, when we pay closer attention to the complication of the geopolitical change in America, your article or the brand new article stood out, and you boldly suggested that why the UN should move to Shanghai. Wow. I have to say that is a bold suggestion. Let's start from the article, Dr. Vinicius. You lay out a couple of reasons why it is rather feasible and practical to move UN to Shanghai. One of the reasons it's related to demographic and economic. Let's start from there. How do we understand that?
Well, I think, Will, and if you pay attention to the last speech by President Trump in the United Nations, he basically said that the United Nations doesn't play any role at all, right? Completely useless. He said that he solved 7 conflicts, never got a phone call from the United Nations, and he listed many complaints about the organization. He's not alone, right? Many countries in the West have been very critical of the United Nations, not realizing how important the organization has been over the last 80 years. And just to think about it, right? The world, even though it's a little complicated sometimes, it's more peaceful than it was 100 years ago. We have more countries, it's true. We have different economic situation. We have, a nuclearized world right now. Still, I think that it's much more peaceful than it was 100 years ago. And we can say, and we can attribute that to the role that the United Nations has played. But of course, the United Nations today is also a reflection of a world long gone. What we see is that the world that we designed in 1945 is very different from the world of 2025. And one of the things that I always say is that the United Nations should represent the majority of the people of the world. And that's why I say that it makes sense for us to move. China is leading this new process, and I think it makes sense for us to move the United Nations to the area in the world where you have most of the population, and also where you see this economic change taking place. In 1945, the United States played a very important role economically in the world, and they had the war, and they had won the war together with the Russians at the time. But the world has changed, and the attention of the world has also shifted. And you can see that there is this movement towards making this the Asian century. And I think, considering that the West has been so critical of the United Nations, perhaps it's time for the United Nations to move out of that part of the world where it's no longer welcome, and move to an area of the world where I'm sure the Chinese would be willing to welcome the United Nations and make it even more relevant, considering the role and the economics that we see in the world today.
Well, Dr. Marcus, again, for the Chinese, and of course, not only for the Chinese nationals and also for international guests, hypothetically speaking, that moving you into Shanghai would be ideal. Again, not only that we know Shanghai, it's one of the popular resorts or popular city for international travels, but also Shanghai, it's well known for international business opportunities. But again, I want to go back to the article. Let's focus on what you wrote in the article, and I quote, representation demands the global governance structure be located closer to the regions where most people live and where the future of the world economy is being forged, end quote. Dr. Marcus, I am no historian and I am not economist either. But one thing I do want to pay attention to the words that you wrote is called global governance. We know that today we look at this geopolitical change and also this relationship between US and China, particularly from this economic standpoint. Again, going back to your thoughts, hypothetically, if UN were to move to Shanghai, what does that say about the global governance at this moment? Again, naturally, within the international community, people would assume that China should play the role of governing the political system or this economic game around the world. But in reality, China is not doing that. And we don't even know China will be interested in doing that. So what do you say to that about the word global governance? And if that were to be the case, then move UN to Shanghai.
I think, Will, that your argument and your question has the answer already. Because China foresees a world that is multipolar. And that's what the Chinese government, and that's what China has been saying. China doesn't like the idea of hegemony. And I think, and I agree that that is an important factor to consider, because we're shifting and we're moving towards that direction. We went through, a world where we had bipolar world during the Cold War with the United Nations, with the United States, the Soviet Union, and then we had a period of a unipolar world with the United States basically ruling supreme all over the world. And then over the last decades, we have seen that shifted again, but not into the direction of a bipolar world, because nobody wants to have a repetition of the Soviet times, right? And that constant threat of a nuclear war, and considering the Chinese diplomatic establishment, you don't want to have that. China doesn't want a new Cold War, and I think that's a very good point, because if the headquarters where the United Nations is headquartered, you are staying in you are based on a country that believes in multipolarity. Different from what we have now with the United Nations in New York. If you have the United Nations sitting in a country which believes in multipolarity, I think that will facilitate even more the possibility of having more voices heard within the United Nations system. I think that we're moving, Will, from a world that in 1945 had, a little bit more than 50 countries around, to a world that has 193 members in the United Nations. And of course, it's a multipolar world. And I think it is a welcome step to see other nations, particularly China, that comes from the global south, leading this process, but not ruling alone in the process. And I think this is a clear message that I get here in Beijing. China doesn't want to be a hegemon like the United States. China doesn't want to be the sheriff of the world. And I think, it is a welcome moment, because I think that we want to see a world that reflects the diversity of its population, the diversity of its values, and also the diversity of its economies. So I think, it makes sense for us to reconsider and understand that the world of 1945 is no longer there, and moving and shifting things is a good sign.
Dr. Marcus, let's go back to another perspective that you presented in the article. Another reason or another major concern, quite frankly, not only from the US perspective, but also from, again, within the international community, is what we called, or what you wrote, the diplomatic neutrality. And we know that, again, Dr. Marcus, you study international relations for so long, you're the expert. China has been very, very transparent and clear when it comes to international affairs. China has never been interested in interfering or nor judging any other countries because what China believes it's internal conflict or domestic differences. But when it comes to diplomatic neutrality today, I think I want to ask this question on behalf of a lot of viewers and audience to you, Dr. Marcus, is how should we define diplomatic neutrality at this moment? Again, we're seeing the war in Ukraine. We're seeing the ongoing tension in the Middle East, especially related to Hamas and the Iran and the Israel. And on top of all that, we continue to see this domestic threat from local terrorists or any other organizations. But China as a country has been, again, very vocal, very bold about the neutrality. But it doesn't seem to work today. Anything happens around the world that demands attention or demands the country to, air quote, take side in order to find better solution. So how do you think that we should understand the term diplomatic neutrality? And how do you think China is handling that if, again, under the condition, hypothetically, that UN headquarters moved to Shanghai?
Unfortunately, we live in a world nowadays that is politically very divided domestically, and this is reflected internationally. And I think that China, a long time ago, established the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. And one of them is non-intervention. And if you look into the Chinese position around the world, China has been consistent with that policy for a long time. And believe it or not, the easiest thing there is to take a side. You know, it's very easy for you to side with one or the other, because now if we have the circumstances, but we also have, you know, the impact of social media that is constantly demanding you to take positions. For you to remain neutral in a situation is a very hard thing to do. Actually, I consider it to be one of the hardest things that you can do. And in any conflict that you have, I think the most important thing is to be able to have the capacity to mediate. And in order to mediate, you have to remain neutral. And I think diplomatic neutrality is basically that, is ensuring that by not taking one side, you have the capacity to mediate any conflict or any problems that may arise.
All right, Dr. Marcus, I have 2 more questions before letting you go. Now, let's talk about another perspective that you and I, we had a discussion before, which related to the centrality, or what you called the waning centrality of the US dollar. How does that play into the factor that, again, going back to the condition that UN were to move to Shanghai? We know that today, everyone, especially the people on the West, are rather concerned about the value of RMB or yuan at this moment. Quite frankly, there are so many countries, especially in Asia, the RMB has become one of the most accessible currencies for local travel or international travel. And again, if we look at the economic agenda under sitting US President Donald Trump, not only we're seeing the ongoing tariff war or the tariff that placed upon the countries, but also we are seeing that tough rhetoric came out of the Trump administration regarding this economic, what he called unfairness. So, Dr. Marcus, from your perspective, how do we understand that? And how do you think that organizations such as BRICS are able to maintain the balance if under the condition that UN were to move to Shanghai? Your thoughts?
I think, Will, that it's important to emphasize that nobody is preaching here the replacement of the dollar as of now, because, the dollar has been a stable currency in the sense that, everywhere you go, it's easily transacted. And I think it's one of the things that the Americans have been able to build. And we owe this, credit. We've got to give credit where credit is due. Now, the thing, though, is that the problem has been that the United States has weaponized the dollar and has weaponized the SWIFT. And because of that, this exorbitant privilege that they have really has created major problems around the world. Because since 1979, the United States understands that it has jurisdiction over the dollar, and no matter where you are. And that really is a problem for countries around the world. With the war in Ukraine, the way the Americans handled the situation, and the way the Russian assets were seized, created a problem for everybody, because you really don't know what could happen in the White House, that all of a sudden sanctions could be, going towards our direction. Look into, for instance, Brazil right now. Brazil has a 50% taxation, import duty, and the country doesn't have even a negative trade balance with the United States. So we don't understand what's going on in Washington. It's not only Donald Trump, it could happen to anybody. So I think that this exorbitant privilege of the dollar has somehow been too weaponized, and somehow the world is looking for alternatives. Now, certainly one of them is the RMB. Of course, there are many economists that say that China needs to open up its economy more for the RMB. But, wherever you start traveling nowadays, you start seeing, the possibility of making payments on WeChat or Alipay, or using RMBs around the world. So I think it is a strategy, a steady construction that China is doing. And because it's not in the interest also of China to replace the dollar, because China still has a lot of dollars, right? A lot of reserves in dollars, and the world has it. So I don't think it's the case of a replacement, but it's a slow construction of alternatives. And I think that the RMB and China is positioning the RMB in a situation that it could eventually be a real effective alternative. And that's why I say, if you put the United Nations in Shanghai, and even if you start, Shanghai is also the headquarters of the BRICS Bank, right? So we start to see this city in China becoming not only a major hub for financial aspects internationally. Shanghai is a real international city, but it makes sense for it to be also a political center in this global South that is looking for alternatives and other possibilities that will reflect this multipolar world that we're living in nowadays.
Dr. Marcus, I want to end our conversation by asking you the last question. Again, this is directly related to what's happening today. Again, I don't know about you, but for me, I'm not a fan of social media. But today, the breaking news came out that Donald Trump, the sitting U.S. President Donald Trump, actually officially endorsed the current leader of Argentina, Milei. Again, from this political standpoint and also from this economic standpoint. And we know that Argentina recently has been growing much closer to the U.S., given the fact that despite the description, look at the relationship between Donald Trump and also of the nation of Argentina. But meanwhile, we know for Argentina to gain the economic support from the U.S. is also crucial. So, Dr. Marcus, from your perspective, someone like someone like Milei in Argentina, and also we're looking at this business type person like Donald Trump, how do we assess this economic agenda at this moment? And why should we be paying paying even closer attention to this economic competition between US and China at this moment? Your final thoughts.
I think that President Milei in Argentina came with an agenda that somehow reflected the political moment of Argentina at the time. But his measures have been showing not to be as effective. He has lost, and there is a sense that he might lose, his political majority in the country, and things are going to become more unstable for him. And certainly the economic situation in Argentina, he has reduced inflation, but currently the situation is not going so well. And if you think about, I was just reading, that Argentina, out of the IMF external debtors, Argentina holds 1/3 of the debt. And so the situation in Argentina is not the most auspicious one, I would say. And initially, you will recall that Milei, Argentina had been invited to be part of BRICS. Milei said no. He wanted to get closer to the United States, which he did. And somehow he realized also that China is a very important player for Argentina. And at the end of the day, Argentina also supplies China with products that they buy from the United States. So in a way, Argentina is also a competitor of the United States in relation to China. So I think President Trump is trying to extend the life of Milei as an important, right-wing politician. But I do not think that this support will be enough to remove Argentina from the difficult economic situation it is. And the problem that Milei suffers and the problem that Milei has is that we might go back to see Argentina in a situation that is even worse, not even worse, but going back politically to what it had before because of the failures of the policies that were implemented by Milei. So I think Trump is trying to support Milei so that he keeps showcasing this political environment that he has constructed in Argentina. But the impression I have is that it's not sustainable. And that's the great challenge for Milei. But most importantly, that is the great challenge for the Argentinian people that seem to be, being in a swamp, an economic swamp for quite some time. And the politicians seem not to be able to take Argentina, which is a lovely country, out of that situation.
Well, again, Dr. Marcus, I agree with you 100%. As we are looking at this economic agenda, particularly looking at these trading relationships between the US and the partners on the left and the partners in Europe and in Asia, again, everyone is very concerned about the card that Trump is going to play. As I mentioned before, we're living in the world where politics might not matter as much as the economy, because at the end of the day, people are also concerning that the food on the table and also the money in the bank account. Well, we don't even know if UN is ever considered move to Shanghai, and surely that will be a great news for Chinese and also for the international diplomats. And if that day comes, we definitely will love to have Dr. Marcus back and to share this exciting news with us. Well, ladies and gentlemen, again, such an honor to speak to Dr. Vinicius De Freitas. Again, Dr. Marcus is a senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, and he focuses on international law, international relations. And I strongly encourage everyone go online to check out this article. It's called Why the UN Should Move to Shanghai. Well, Dr. Marcus, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and we'd love to have you back on the show for our future episodes.